Good evening. Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics program for this evening. My name is Gabriel Bright, and I welcome you to the program. I am a member of this Institute Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The SAB is a bipartisan group. As a member of the SAB, I get access to many great opportunities by being involved with the Institute. If you are a student and are interested in joining, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. For this evening's event, if you would like to know more about our guests, the event itself, upcoming Institute events, and more, you can download a printable program handout. The link is in the event description below. At the end of this evening's event, we will have time for you to ask questions of the guests. Please email your questions to dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around oftentimes important topics and difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. And now, please join me in welcoming Director of the Institute, Bill Lacy.
Gabriel, thank you very, very much. Great job on the student welcome tonight. We appreciate all the support from the many members of our Student Advisory Board and looking forward to hopefully getting them back at the Dole Institute in person starting in the fall if things continue to improve with the pandemic. But welcome everyone to tonight's program about one of the giants of the Senate, former Indiana Senator Birch Bayh. Tonight's program is co-sponsored by the KU School of Journalism, the Department of Political Science, and the Department of History. Our special guest tonight is Robert Blaimeier. Bob served as an aide to Senator Bayh from 1967 to 1980. He's written a splendid new book about Senator Bayh called Birch, Bayh, Making a Difference. Bob, it's great to have you here tonight.
It's delightful to be here, Bill. Thanks very much.
Yeah, let's start with just a little bit of background on you, Bob, so my audience has a little bit of context. Can you tell us about your upbringing and education and also some of the roles that you played with Senator Bayh over the years?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. If you want me to talk about myself, I might take the whole hour. So I guess I ought to be conservative here. I grew up in Hammond, Indiana, and got accepted to George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And the first day after my parents left town, when I got to GW, I took a bus down to Capitol Hill to offer my 18 years of life experience to the junior senator from Indiana. And once I got my foot in the door, I never left. Basically, I ended up working for him from the time I was a freshman in college through his election defeat in 1980, and we remained social friends afterwards. I grew up in a household that was not very political. My father was a firefighter, and I had an interest in politics and government. And I knew about Birch Bayh because he had pulled Ted Kennedy from the wreckage of the plane crash in 1964 when Kennedy broke his back. I grew up a Kennedy fan. John Kennedy inspired a lot of people of my generation to be interested in politics, and I thought that gave Birch Bayh a celebrity status that made me want to at least go over and meet him and work for him if I could. And I was fortunate to be able to do that. I had various tasks throughout the year. I think where my life really changed with him was sophomore year when his secretary asked me if I could rearrange my classes around driving him to and from work in the morning and the evenings, and I could keep his car. So I would call that a no-brainer of a question. I mean, I was a sophomore in college. I got to spend time with him every day, which is what I wanted to do. Plus, I had a car thrown in as well. And that is really where our personal relationship bonded. And over the years, I became his office manager. Then I worked in federal projects, what we call our Indiana department. In the 1974 campaign, when he ran for re-election against Richard Lugar, I traveled with him throughout that campaign for 5 months with 3 days off. So that was another, let's say, a more intensive bonding experience. And 6 years later, in 1980, I was the political director of that campaign. which we lost in the Reagan landslide.
Okay. Bob, what really drove you to write this book?
Well, it started probably about 20 years ago when we had the Bayhs over for dinner. My wife and I, with Birch and his wife had mentioned to mine that she thought I ought to write his biography. I started talking to him about it. He was not interested in that. He thought he was going to do it himself. And since we were already at that point 20 years past the end of his career, I thought that was unlikely. And I started introducing him to authors to try to get it done. He also wanted the story told. He felt he had a lot of history that ought to be passed along, and I agreed. And what happened was, one day I suggested to him that I had interviewed my parents on videotape over a period of 7 years. And since that time, my father passed away, and the videos became priceless, and they're incredibly valuable for my siblings and me. So I suggested to him, how about if I do that with you? He didn't think that was a bad idea. So he agreed to do that. This was 2012. And we started taking it very seriously. And I would send him emails in advance and tell him what I was going to talk about. We ended up doing 30 hours of interviews over the next 2.5 years. And in the middle of that, I got the contract from Indiana University to write the book. And ironically, the publication date was the date of his memorial service in Indianapolis a few months after he died.
Yeah, that's amazing that's how that actually occurred and took place. Now, tell us a little bit about how Senator Bayh's background influenced his politics.
That's a good question, Bill, because in many ways, I would say it was his relationship with his father and his relationship with being with the land as a farmer. He grew up in Shirkyville. He was born in Shirkyville, Indiana, or actually born in Terre Haute. His parents lived in Shirkyville. And his mother was an educator. His father was an educator. They were both into schools. His father was a high school basketball referee. Birch got involved in 4-H as a young man, and he enjoyed public speaking. In fact, his first wife, Marvella, he met her in a speech contest in Chicago in which she won. He came in second. As he always said, she won, but I got the girl. He found himself, he got involved in college politics. He was senior class president. He was the president of his fraternity. He liked politics. Those who know him will remember him as a very affable man who really liked people. And, I've often said when I look at his career, he didn't have a mission. He didn't have a mindset of what he wanted to accomplish philosophically. He was more a problem solver. He saw problems and he wanted to deal with them. But in terms of the electoral history, he hadn't thought about it at all, I don't think, growing up. And then a good friend of his father's in Terre Haute suggested to him that there was an opportunity for him to run for the legislature. This father's friend was very close to his dad, but was also the brother of the minority leader of the Indiana General Assembly. And there was an opening to run the seat. Birch ran it, and he won the seat, went to the House. And one of the amazing things I think about his early career was that at the age of 30, he was Speaker of the House. And the age of 34, he was United States Senator.
That was very early, especially back then, for someone to be elected to the Senate. Tell us about the senator's role in passing the 25th Amendment and why that was so important.
Okay. What happened was in 1963, his first year in the Senate, which, as you'll remember, is also the year when President Kennedy was assassinated, Birch was the only member of the Judiciary Committee that didn't have a subcommittee. And when Estes Kefauver, the senator from Tennessee, died, Birch went and asked Chairman Eastland, James Eastland in Mississippi, for the chairmanship of the Subcommittee on Constitutional Amendments, which he eventually got. And not long after that, President Kennedy was assassinated. And the question came up very early, what if he had lived? What if his body had lived and he was basically brain dead? he was so damaged he wouldn't have survived as a full-fledged adult. He could have had his heart could have kept beating. There was nothing in it, the Constitution, that allowed for a transfer of power to the vice president. Plus, the vice presidency itself had been vacant many times, which it was now, and the new president, Lyndon Johnson, had a serious heart attack. So there was an issue here about who would succeed him. We had a Speaker of the House and a Senate President pro tem, both in their 80s. And so there's a great concern about the whole line of presidential succession. Add to that, we are in the nuclear age. And could the country really afford to have any questions raised about who is next in line and who is the legitimate president? So he went to work on it right away. And by 1967, the 25th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. That is, the 25th Amendment is the presidential disability and succession. It's gotten a lot of attention in the last couple of years.
Tell us a little bit about the senator's role on the Title IX reforms. That was one of his big contributions, very important piece of legislation.
Well, it's kind of a longer story because when he was having hearings in the Judiciary Committee on another issue, women protesters were being disruptive, and he said his attitude was he was going to clear the room, but instead he asked a staff guy to go back and find out what they were agitating about. And after the staff guy came back and said they were agitating for an equal rights amendment. Birch said he would agree to meet with him if they would quiet down and let him have his hearing. And he met with him, and he found himself very much in agreement about the need for an equal rights amendment that would basically prevent people from being discriminated against on the grounds of gender. And he became the Senate's chief sponsor of the Equal Rights Amendment. And as we approached 1972, the Equal Rights Amendment wasn't moving quickly along as efficiently as he'd hoped. The Educational Opportunity Act came forward, and Birch took language out of the Equal Rights Amendment and put it into the Educational Opportunity Act as Title IX. It basically said, if a college or university takes federal money, then they can't treat men and women differently in their programs, in their admissions, and everything else. People think of Title IX as a creation of women's sports, and in many ways it was, but it had nothing to do with women's sports in the beginning. It was actually Birch's first wife, Marvella, who kept complaining to him that she had wanted to get it to be admitted to University of Virginia for graduate school and had been turned down because it was male only. And she kept saying, Birch, it just doesn't seem right to me that these colleges can take federal money and yet you allow them to discriminate against women. He thought that made a lot of sense, and so he promoted the Equal Rights Amendment and eventually Title IX. And Title IX has changed this country in many ways, and it earned him quite a few accolades over the years.
Yeah, in addition, as you point out, Bob, in addition to being elected to the U.S. Senate at a very young age, Senator Bayh also had the distinction of throwing his hat in the ring for the 76 Democratic presidential nomination. That was a really interesting election year. I'd like to hear more about why he decided to run and kind of how that went.
Well, again, it's a longer story. It goes back a few years because if you remember, in 1969, 1970, there were two Nixon nominees to the Supreme Court. Ainsworth and Carswell were both turned away by the Senate. That had never happened before or since. And in both cases, Birch Bayh was the leader of the opposition to defeat those nominations. It gave him a great deal of national celebrity. And he had, over this period of time, had developed some very strong feelings, you might say, about Richard Nixon. And so he decided to run in 1972 to try to keep Nixon from a second term. And what happened in 1971 is that his wife, Marvella, developed breast cancer and had to have a mastectomy, and Birch dropped out of that race. But he already had a kind of a national following in many ways. A lot of people that were part of that early organization remained close to him. And after he was reelected in 1974, almost immediately, people were coming at him from all over the country saying, you know, Gerald Ford is the president, but he's not in a strong position. He's beatable, and Birch felt that he was as good as anybody else to run against him and do it. I could tell you that he never thought early on that it would be Jimmy Carter. I mean, Jimmy Carter had been the governor of Georgia and running around Iowa for most of 1975. Birch had had a grueling reelection campaign in 74 and was physically dog tired in 1975, which I can testify to. I'm 21 years younger than him, and I was dog tired in 1975. Nonetheless, he got in that race, and as it unfolded, he and Morris Udall decided to go after Carter in the Iowa caucuses. The caucuses had existed before, but they had never been prominent in the presidential nominating sweepstakes. And in those caucuses, none of the above came in first. Carter came in second, and Bayh came in third. And then he proceeded on to New Hampshire, and Carter came in first, Udall came in second, Bayh came in third. And after that, he dropped further down in the pack and eventually dropped out of the race. So it was something that I would say that he was never sorry he did, but I think that going through that exercise and losing, it pretty well took that ambition away from him.
What kind of a candidate was he, and not just in that presidential race, but in those Senate races that you talked about?
You know, when we lost in 1980, I remember having a conversation with the pollster Peter Hart, and he told me that he'd gotten a call election night from Doug Bailey, who was a prominent Republican consultant, who told him that about Birch Bayh losing. He's saying, "I think Birch Bayh was the best retail politician I had ever seen," and I think most people would agree. He was as good at it on the ground as anybody I had ever seen, and it was because he liked it. He liked people. He liked campaigning. I think that his success, to a large degree, in a very conservative, Republican-oriented state, was due to that personality, the hard campaigning, the affability. He was smart. He was great on his feet. I had a terrific interview during this process of working on the book with former Senator Lugar, and we had defeated Lugar in '74. And then he came back and defeated Senator Harkey in 1976. And he and Birch served together in the Senate and became close friends. A testament to the way the Senate was at the time and is not now. And Lugar said to me, "I don't think I would have won in 1976 if I hadn't run against Birch in 1974. And he said to me, I'll never forget it. He said it was like studying at the feet of the master. He said, I'd always heard he was good. I didn't know he was that good.
What made him so good as a retail campaigner? So many candidates that I've had experience with kind of acquired that, but it wasn't really ever natural to them. What made him so good at that retail campaigning?
I think because it was natural. I honestly believe that. I don't know if I ever saw him in public where he wasn't at ease, where he didn't feel good about it. I mean, he enjoyed campaigning. He enjoyed shaking hands at plant gates 4 and 5 in the morning, something I hated. He liked putting himself in controversial situations that would challenge him. When busing was a big issue, I'll never forget. He convened a town meeting in Indianapolis and said to the public, "I'll take any and all questions until they're done." And the session went around the clock, like 24 hours, on his feet answering questions about busing. He felt very strongly that this was his role and that the people had a right to hear from him, be able to touch him and see him, and to be able to judge him based on his judgment. And he worked very hard at making sure that people knew what his judgment was.
I don't think there's any doubt, Bob, that the greatest collaboration between Senator Bayh and Senator Bob Dole was the Bayh-Dole Act. Could you tell us about the importance of the Bayh-Dole Act and how it came
Yeah,
to be?
I'd like to do that. I mean, I have a number. The Bayh name and the Dole name will forever be linked because of Bayh-Dole, and it's actually its impact is amazing, and the story about it you may not know is terrific. I actually have a few instances of writing about Senator Dole in my book, and one of the first is when he was running for re-election in 1974, and Gerald Ford pardoned President Nixon, and Bob Dole's comment was, I needed that like I needed a case of the clap, only in the inimitable Bob Dole fashion, I might say. So let me say a few things about what Bayh Dole does, and then I'll talk to you about how it came about. Patent law in 1980, if the federal government had any money in the development of a patent at a small business or a university, the federal government reserved the right to bring it to market. And of the 28,000 patents owned by the federal government at that time, only 5% of them were being brought into market. Some professors from Purdue had come to the Senate office to complain to Birch that they had been critical in helping some development, some inventions at Purdue that had some federal funding, and the rights to market them were taken out of their hands and reserved for the government. And on examination, those rights to market were almost like that last scene in Indiana Jones, where they're taking the Ark of the Covenant and putting it on the empty shelves. That's what was happening to American innovation. We were no longer the world's leader in new inventions and copyrights because of this combination of federal restrictions on who owns the rights to market these things. And so while our staff was looking into that, it was discovered that the Dole staff was doing the same thing. And so the two staffs got together, Birch and Bob Dole got together and decided to collaborate on the bill. In fact, this was something that was very common with Birch Bayh, and I'm sure with many senators at that time. The first thing he always wanted to do in introducing a piece of legislation was to get a Republican co-sponsor. And so this working with Senator Dole on it was a natural for him. And when the bill passed, The Economist magazine, I like to quote from, wrote a piece about Bayh Dole legislation. Let me read from it. In 2002, an Economist editorial said, possibly the most inspired piece of legislation to be enacted in America over the past half century was the Bayh Dole Act of 1980. Together with amendments in 1984 and augmentation in 1986, this unlocked all the inventions and discoveries that had been made in laboratories throughout the United States with the help of taxpayers' money. More than anything, this single policy measure helped to reverse America's precipitous slide into industrial irrelevance. And then later in the book, I give a sort of a bulleted items about what it meant for the country. University innovations created almost 2 startup companies per day by 2005 and 2 new commercial products per day by 2013. 6,500 new companies have been founded as a result of these innovations, and 153 drugs, vaccines, and in vitro devices have been brought to market. Campus patents grew to 3,278 by 2005, as well as 4,932 academic licenses and 28,349 active licenses overall. The act caused the creation of 279,000 new jobs, and support was provided for another 3.8 million jobs. By 2015, the academic industry licensing created by Bayh Dole had contributed up to $1.18 trillion to the US economy, with $22.8 million in directly reported sales from commercialized academic inventions. The biotechnology industry that is so large today is rooted in this academic research, as is nanotechnology, all of this directly tied to the policies in place because of Bayh Dole. Now, one of the great things, the great stories involving Bayh Dole was that when it came time to campaign in 1980, which both Bob Dole and Birch Bayh were running for re-election, the bill had failed in the Senate. Russell Long, the Senate Finance Committee chair, senator from Louisiana, Huey Long's son, had called it the worst piece of legislation he'd ever seen. And he felt as long as the taxpayers had a nickel in it, the taxpayers owned it. What happened was, after we lost the election in 1980, a lame duck session was called because the budget hadn't been passed. And Birch gets a call from Russell Long, and he says, Birch, we're going to miss you here. I'm going to miss working with you. That patent bill you and Bob Dole had, it's yours. In other words, the bill was given to him as a parting gift for losing that Senate race, and it has changed the country. One company that was created in one of these university federal sponsorships that before by Dole could not have been brought to market is Google. So it's had a remarkable impact on the country, and it's something that most people are not aware of.
Yeah, I can attest to that. I think it is arguably one of the most significant parts of both senators' legacies. Why were they so well suited, Bob, to work together?
You know, that's a hard one for me to answer since I work more in the politics than the legislation. But I would say that basically they genuinely like each other. They're very much down to earth guys, speak their minds. There's no phoniness about either of them. In fact, a really interesting video interview during my process with Orrin Hatch of Utah. It was one of the things he said about Birch Bayh. He said, he and I were very different on the issues. I call myself a hard conservative. He was a hard liberal, but I always knew where he stood. I always knew he'd do what he said. Your word is your bond. I would say that Bob Dole operated his career that way, and Birch Bayh operated his career that way. And that was not true of all their colleagues. I mean, there were members of the Senate that Birch didn't get along with, but some of his best friends in the Senate, by the way, in those 18 years, were Republican senators.
How is Congress different today than it used to be when Senator Bayh and Senator Dole were able to collaborate on that legislation?
Well, let me tell you a little story that sort of illustrates it. I think that the Russell Long Bayh Dole story is part of that. In 1963, Birch's first year in the Senate, here he's a 35-year-old senator. Bobby Kennedy was the Attorney General. He invited members of the Judiciary Committee to go on the presidential yacht Sequoia up the Potomac, and it was mainly so Kennedy could get to know the members on the Judiciary Committee better. And Birch said, "Here I am, sitting below decks with sitting on the stairs and a plate of food on my knees. And who sits next to me but Everett Dirksen of Illinois?" You may remember that Everett Dirksen was the Senate Minority Leader, the Republican leader in the Senate, quite a personality in himself. He sits down next to Birch and he says, "Birch, you and I have to start talking about how we can get you reelected." And Birch said, "What's that, Senator?" And he repeated it and talked about how the perks of office can help one politically, the Senate recording studio, the franking privilege, things like that. It was just the fact that the partisanship wasn't as important as the fact that they were both members of this institution. There was a great deal of compromise in those days, a great deal of cooperation across the aisle. If you look at the number of senators on both parties that voted for the various constitutional amendments that he sponsored, the Haynesworth and Carswell votes, a large number of Republicans supported him. It was much more of a conservative versus liberal divide than a Democratic versus Republican divide. But I think also the bywords of compromise and that tomorrow's ally can be, or today's ally can be tomorrow's adversary and vice versa. And those are things that people live by. There was a story I heard when Joe Biden was still in the Senate that may or may not be true. But the way I heard it was that Rick Santorum got elected to the Senate, came to the floor, and Biden approached him and said, "Rick, it's nice to meet you. Congratulations on your election. I look forward to working with you." And Santorum said, "I don't know why we'll not get along on anything." I think there has been a sea change in mentality. It's very frustrating. It's very hard to be optimistic about it, but it's a man-made problem, and it can be solved by man. I think President Biden right now is making a yeoman effort at doing that.
Tell us a little bit about Senator Bayh's post-Senate career. What did he kind of pursue? What did he try to accomplish?
Well, he in office, you may remember that he was responsible for authoring two constitutional amendments, and it's been said that no one since the founding fathers have offered more than one. And to put this in different perspective, there have been 11,000 attempts to amend the Constitution in our history, and since the Bill of Rights, only 17 have been successful. He's got two of them. In addition, he almost got the Equal Rights Amendment passed. It was passed by both houses of Congress and ratified by only enough states for it to run out of time with 3 states remaining. And he pushed his amendment to get rid of the Electoral College further than it had ever gotten in the Senate or in the Congress in its history. So he came close to 4 constitutional amendments. In years afterwards, he had to earn a living. He wasn't wealthy. He had huge debt. He had to earn a living, and he joined, practiced law like a lot of members do. For a while, both in Indianapolis and in Washington, and eventually in Washington. He got remarried the year after the election and started a family again with another son born in 1982. Politically, he wasn't going to get back involved in politics because Evan was getting involved in politics. And if you remember, part of the Birch Bayh legacy is the fact that after he left office, his son Evan ran for first Secretary of State and then successfully for governor, was governor for 2 terms, and then ran for the United States Senate and served in Birch's seat for 2 terms. So Birch felt that this was time to step aside and it was Evan's turn. But he remained active with things like the National Popular Vote Compact, to try to put, and on the Electoral College National Popular Vote issue, by the way, Senator Dole changed his mind and came along with us on that amendment before we left office. The National Popular Vote Compact is an effort to get states to agree to cast their electoral votes, not for the winner of that state's popular vote, but for the winner of the national popular vote. And he became very invested in that, spent a lot of time with that organization. He did public speaking on a number of occasions. He campaigned for Evan on occasion, and eventually even for Barack Obama in Indiana when Obama actually won Indiana in 2008. But much of the time was earning a living, raising a second family, and trying to remain involved in the issues that were of importance to it.
I want to come back to the second Senator Bayh in just a moment, Bob, but the point you made about the constitutional amendments was fascinating. Other than the 25th Amendment, what was the other one that he was successful in getting through?
That was the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age to 18. He was it was actually that was not as difficult as some of the others he worked on, because at the time the Vietnam War was on, and the slogan constantly became that if you're old enough to fight for your country, you ought to be old enough to vote for the people who sent you there. And so that amendment passed pretty easily, but it put 2 of them under his belt. And again, he worked far harder later on for the Equal Rights Amendment and the Direct Election Amendment. And I would say that what he said in the interviews I did with him, when I asked what is your greatest professional disappointment, it was this failure to pass direct popular election and get rid the country of the Electoral College. And I can go on that subject for hours, and I try to address it with some level of scholarship in the book.
So, how did Senator Evan Bayh carry on his dad's legacy?
Well, they're very different people. Evan is not what Evan was. I would say categorize Evan as a more conservative politician than his dad, but had the same level of personal attractiveness, affability, likability. The Bayh name is a very strong name in Indiana, and because when you think about it, here Birch ran statewide for the first time in 1962, again in 68, 74, 80, and then in 1986, Evan was running statewide. 86, 88, 92, 90, and so on. So that's a lot of elections with a statewide candidate named Bayh. And Evan was a young governor. He had his twin boys were born while they were in the state house. And that was so unusual for when you think of the image of most governors. Usually their grandfathers or grandmothers when they become governors, not new fathers of newborn twins. Unfortunately, Evan recently lost his wife just a matter of some weeks ago to glioblastoma at the age of 61. Far too young. She's had a very, very difficult last 2 years. But it is quite a legacy when you think about, serving 18 years in the Senate, having your son follow you in the Senate and as governor. And then there are a number of people that have moved on from the Bayh orbit who have done remarkable things. And most recently, President Biden's chief of staff, Ron Klain, used to work in the Bayh office, going back to when he was very young.
And I'm curious, hearing Ron's name, what did he do for Senator Bayh?
Well, Ron was very young in the office. He was literally in high school. And one of my responsibilities the last 3 years we were in office was I managed the whole Indiana staff, the regional coordinators, county coordinators, staff people in our Indianapolis office. And I'll never forget we get when Diane Meyer-Simon in our Indianapolis office called me to say she had this high school kid working for her, was really smart and wanted to have him come out to Washington and get to know the staff there. So Ron came out. I got to know him. He stayed at my house, and he continued to volunteer and intern, after school, through high school, and then worked basically directly for me in the 1980 reelection campaign. Not positions of high authority. He was awfully young to give him that, even though many of us were young when we got high responsibilities. But Ron started. He was 17 or 18 years old, and we've all remained in touch. The whole Bayh network is in touch pretty regularly to this day, and there's a great deal of pride out there about Ron and what he's doing.
I bet there is, and it well should be. What lessons can be drawn from Senator Bayh and his career and his legacy that would lead us perhaps towards a renewal of bipartisanship?
Wow. Well, the lessons from his legacy, I would say, let's go back to the title of the book, One Man Can Make a Difference, or Birch Bayh Making a Difference. He used to always say that. He felt that everybody can make a difference if they really invest themselves and really commit themselves to doing that. We need to look toward electing people who basically feel that bipartisanship is important, that compromise is important. Half a loaf is better than no loaf. It's important to move the ball down the road instead of, my way or the highway, which seems to be the attitude these days. Frankly, Bill, I'm not sure I have a good answer, except for the fact that there has to be one. We have to find a better way to make our system work. And right now, as you know, there's a lot of discussion about changing the filibuster or getting rid of it. I think that there are some very serious systemic flaws in our system right now that need to be addressed. Campaign finance is clearly one of them. The way redistricting is handled, gerrymandering is another. People need to be able to support candidates. And first of all, you need to be able to compete in areas that are competitive. And right now, redistricting has taken away the competition, a lot of the House seats. I mean, there's some very, very serious issues that need to be addressed if we're going to be able to cure some of the ills and the no do nothingness of the current Congress. It's very toxic right now, and it's very sad.
We've talked about Senator Bayh's legacy. It's really quite impressive. Not many senators leave office today having passed a landmark piece of legislation like Bayh-Dole and being associated with 2 constitutional amendments. What else do you think are critical components of Senator Bayh's legacy?
Bill, it's actually, I'm glad you asked that because that's what I like to talk about here. It's really an astonishing level of achievement. He co-sponsored, for instance, with Orrin Hatch in Utah, civil rights for the institutionalized, to make sure people who are in our mental institutions and prisons are protected and put under the federal umbrella to protect them from abuse. In 1978, he had responded to Ruth Bader Ginsburg and a number of female activists that wanted to respond to a Supreme Court case where a woman sued General Electric, her employer, for not getting her health benefits when she was pregnant. And again, with the help of RBG and a number of the women activists of the day, they wrote legislation that became the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978. It is the law of the land to this day, which says in effect that since only women can be pregnant, to deny them benefits under your health plans is discriminatory under the Civil Rights Act. Again, this was not part of a philosophical mindset. It was a way of solving a problem that he saw. In the area of women's rights, we have the Equal Rights Amendment, we have Title IX, we have the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. He also sponsored the first female to be appointed district attorney in the country's history, hired the first female chief counsel of the Senate subcommittee. So his role in terms of advancing the cause of women is very strong. You add to that, there was the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, the Runaway Youth Act, Disaster Relief Act. He was critical in the early days of forming FEMA and FISA under the disaster relief legislation. So it is a long list of bills that he had his name behind and was critical in their passage. And the constitutional amendments are kind of the highlights, the ribbons and the road, the medals. But there are a lot of very hardly won important pieces of legislation that he put his efforts behind.
I have one more question tonight, but I wanted to let our audience know that we do take audience questions. You can submit a question by emailing us at dolequestions@ku.edu. That's dolequestions@ku.edu, and send some questions along, and we'll try to get to as many as we possibly can. But my final question tonight, Bob, one of the, I'm sure many things you and I have in common is we got into politics at a very early age. And one of the things we really focus on at the Dole Institute is building a student culture so that they can learn about politics and public service. What would you say to our young people at KU, but all across the country, about the importance of getting involved in public service and politics?
Bill, that's a great question to address because I personally believe if you want to help make a difference, get involved. It doesn't matter what area you get involved in. It doesn't matter what level you get involved in. Sometimes you have to put your ego aside and do things that you may feel, you're too qualified to do. I actually can remember having interns that would quit because they thought the jobs we were giving them weren't substantive enough. You have to be willing to roll your sleeves up and go to work. And this could mean running for office. It could mean working for a city councilman. It can mean being an activist, going to the streets. Just be involved. If you're not part of the problem, part of the solution, then you're part of the problem. I think that, it's just so important for people to feel that there is a path, and you have to find a way that fits your personality, your ambitions, your desires, and then go after it. There are no guarantees. You're going to take your lumps. Not everything's going to work out. Losing that election in 1980 for me, I couldn't, my world was crushed. It was hard, but they happen. You have to pick yourself up and keep going. Many times we've heard Joe Biden talk about that. You're going to get knocked down. You got to just pick yourself up and keep going. The fact is, there are pathways to be involved. You don't want to violate principles. You want to be honest. You want to be true to yourself, but you want to commit yourself to something. And again, don't feel it has to be, president of the United States, king of the world. It has to be something. Just commit yourself, get involved, and put your energy into it.
Okay. My first audience question tonight is really a very good one. And frankly, I wish I had asked this question. What challenges did Senator Bayh face politically in serving as a Democratic senator in a fairly conservative Republican state?
Fairly conservative would be an understatement. Well, he faced a number of challenges. I would say that one of the advantages he had is in the era when he was first running, politics wasn't nearly as nationalized as it is now. It wasn't nationally televised all over, and it was far more local. And so people in Indiana, I think they felt they knew him. They weren't seeing him on national television. They would see him in their local television and hear him on the radio, and they'd often see him in person, given his frenetic style. He created many of the challenges for himself by attaching himself to what we might call the hot and button issues of the day, the things that made us proud to work for him. He, for instance, helped pass one of the landmark pieces of gun control legislation in the 60s to ban the importation, sale, and manufacture of Saturday night specials, cheap handguns most often used in the commission of crime. This was legislation that was he was asked to sponsor by the National Association of Chiefs of Police. Policemen were being killed by these cheap handguns, and Birch thought it made sense to sponsor it. He paid a price politically throughout his career for that. The second hot button issue that he became very identified with, that became a challenge politically, was abortion. After Roe v. Wade made their decision, which ironically was on his birthday, as chairman of the subcommittee on constitutional amendments, the right to life, pro-life constitutional amendment kept coming before his panel. And by the time we ran in 1980, 5 times, he had been the deciding vote to kill that constitutional amendment. He didn't believe it belonged in the Constitution Amendment and was committed to a woman's right to choose. These were, being true to himself, standing for what he believed in. He always felt that, if I have to go against what I believe simply to get reelected, why is it worth being reelected? I mean, he did not trim his sails, you might say. And this was something that, again, that those of us who worked for him were very proud of.
Next question is from Peter. He asks, how did Senator Bayh feel about the role of activist government, and who were his political heroes?
Wow. Well, his overall hero was his father, who we called Colonel Bayh. His political heroes, I think he had a great deal of admiration for FDR, and the first president he ever met. He was a former president at the time. Harry Truman was another that he respected a great deal. I'm not sure. I didn't have conversation with him relative to that. I don't know. I mean, I've spent a lot more time in my life reading presidential history and developing, allegiances to politicians throughout history than I think he did. Although I just don't know, because it's not something that we really discussed. I do know of his deep affection for Harry Truman and for FDR, but his father would be the person that would probably be his greatest hero.
Okay. My next question is addressed to your career, Bob. What did you do after the 80 Senate race? You said how devastating that was, but what did you do in politics after that?
Okay. Well, one of the things that most disturbed me about the nature of our 1980 race, for those who remember that era, was the new right. There was this amalgam of organizations that were practicing negative politics, single issue politics, coming from the outside and attacking. Basically, it was a series of liberal Democratic senators using the hot button issues to generate money and opposition to them. It was like fighting a phantom. You couldn't get your hands around it. It's not like opposing a candidate. And these were theoretically independent operations, moral majority, National Conservative Political Action Committee, that was known as NCPAC. There were a number of them. And I just felt very, very nervous about their impact on our politics. Felt it was a bad thing for our politics. And I ended up forming an organization in 1981 called Committee for American Principles, which my hope was that we could establish committees in the states that were being targeted by these new right organizations, to try to find ways to use the law basically against them, to try to get people to speak out. We always had our friends coming to us. They would hear Birch Bayh called a baby killer on TV by some right-wing minister, televangelist in Indianapolis. And they would say, well, somebody's got to do something. Somebody's got to do it. I would think, well, that's what I wanted to help do, was find a way to get somebody to start doing something. That became very important to me, but raising money to get it done was not my forte, and it was very difficult. I was spending all my time trying to keep the doors open, and eventually was offered an opportunity by Bob Keefe was the name of the guy who was Birch's administrative assistant when I joined the staff in 1967. And Keefe called me one day and asked me if I knew how to find computerized voter lists. He had a friend who was hired by the AFL-CIO to find computerized voter lists that they could use to match against their membership to tell them who's registered to vote. He said, "Can you do that?" I said, "Sure." I had no idea how to do that. But the idea was I got hired to do it, made tons of mistakes in the process, and in that process really kind of helped create a new industry in politics, which is the part of politics now known as big data. I began for the next almost 35 years, built voter lists, computerized voter lists, tried to push the data world forward into, understanding how to use data to better target and to deliver messages and to influence elections. So I ended up forming my own company after working for a couple of different companies. And literally for 17 years, I had my own company building voter lists, mostly for Democratic state parties and progressive organizations. And then for the last 8 years I was in the business, I worked for an organization called Catalyst, which my company had merged with, to again push the data world forward, make it work better for progressive organizations and democratic politics. I decided as I was approaching the 2016 cycle, and my whole life seems to have operated in 2-year cycles, I needed to finish the book. I was very committed at that point to finishing the book. And I was also realizing I was entering my 25th election cycle working in politics, and that's too many for anybody. So I decided that after 16, I was going to hang up my spikes and not work in politics full time anymore, but to finish the book and try to enjoy that process as well.
Right. Zachary asks, what changes do you think Senator Bayh would champion today?
Now, I think I thought about this a lot because we did talk about this in the later years before he passed away. He was very disturbed about the lack of civility in the Senate, particularly, and the lack of the ability for Republicans and Democrats to get along. I think he would have tried to devote his attention to that. And he was in touch with a lot of his former colleagues. He still had a name that was recognized in the Senate, and he was energized about it. When Evan Bayh decided to retire and not run for re-election in 2016, he talked a lot about how the Senate was dysfunctional. And Birch's comment at the time to me was, I would have wanted to stay and fight the SOBs. And basically, he felt it was a sad state of affairs. One of the ironies is when you look back at those Supreme Court contests I was talking about, Haynsworth and Carswell, when Birch was heading the opposition to defeat Judge Haynsworth for the Supreme Court, Haynsworth's side was led by Senator Marlowe Cook of Kentucky. And when the vote was over, Cook walked out of the Senate chambers with Birch, put his arm around him, said, Birch, let's find something you and I can work on together. And they did. But the irony of that is that Marlowe Cook's staff guy was Mitch McConnell, which tells me he didn't learn a whole lot about that level of mentality from that era.
Bob, I have one final question from our audience tonight. It's a good one. What is your favorite story about your time? Actually, I have two questions left. What is your favorite story about your time working for Senator Bayh?
Oh boy. There are a lot, as you might imagine. I've joked with many people over the years that he really was such a good-natured guy, hugely important in my life. The only time he ever raised his voice in 13 years of working for him and more like 50 years of being his friend was he wanted to warm up for the congressional baseball game with Evan and with a couple of my friends, and he asked me to go out and buy baseballs. I had never spent any of his money, so I decided I would buy the cheapest baseballs I could to save his money. And when he started hitting them, they dented. And he really got upset with me. And literally, I don't think he ever raised his voice with me since. There are times that you learn things. There was one time in the 1974 campaign, he and I arrived at Evansville, Indiana on a small plane, or we were going to leave Evansville on a small plane. And before getting on the plane, we decided to stop at a Denny's and pick up food. I went in to order the food, and as Birch would do, he walked around to shake hands with every one of the patrons in the Denny's. And as I'm ordering the food, someone taps me in the shoulder, and I turn around, and the man says, "Are you with Senator Bayh?" And I said, "I am." He said, "Well, my name's Kenny Campbell, and if you have him sit with my wife, my mother, and me, I'll give $1,000 to your campaign." And I immediately said, where are you sitting? And he pointed it out, and I went over and told Birch that there's a guy over here named Kenny Campbell. If you sit with him and his wife and his mother, he'll give the campaign $1,000. And Birch said, where's he sitting? So he headed over there, and I went back to the counter to finish my order. And while I was finishing placing the order, I get tapped on the shoulder again. And I turned around, and it's a policeman. He said, "Are you with Senator Bayh?" I said, "I am." He said, "Well, you ought to know that the man he's sitting with over there is reputed to be a member of organized crime in Evansville." And I said, "Well, thank you, officer." And Birch and I had a way of communicating. When I would tell him he had to leave, he would usually just push me aside and say, I'm with the constituent. But when I was really serious, "You have to leave," I would ask it a little differently, and he would always respond. And I gave him the serious "we have to leave." And he said, "Oh, okay." And he got up and we're leaving, and Campbell walks outside with us. I'm 25 years old, mind you, and I should have known a lot more about campaign finance law than I did, because Campbell pulls out a wad of cash. And as Birch is walking into the car, Campbell hands me 50 or 60 $100 bills, which I go ahead and put away in my pocket, not realizing I violated every campaign finance contribution law of the time, although the statute of limitations is now passed. Um, so we get in the car, and Birch said, "What was that all about?" And I told him, "Well, he's reputed to be a member of organized crime." And he says, "Well, did you get the $1,000? And I pulled out the cash. I said, "I have a lot more than that." And Birch reaches down and picks up a medallion that Campbell had wearing around his neck. And he said, "I have his medallion he gave me." And so we get back to the headquarters, and we call over Jay Berman, who was the campaign manager, had been chief of staff in the Senate, to tell him this. And Jay starts ripping me a new one. "You dumb son of a gun. Don't you know that you can't take more than $200 cash from anybody? And there's a $1,000 contribution limit. You violate every law." And he's swearing up a blue streak, takes some money from me, takes the information on how to contact Campbell, says he'll deal with it. We agree we're not going to tell anybody about this. This is a bad story. A couple of weeks later, we're back in Evansville, and we're getting picked up by the county chairman, who was also the county sheriff. And he arrives late. We're waiting in the runway as he comes screeching down the road with a cherry top, flying around and heading toward us, dust flying. He gets there. He says, "Oh, Birch, I'm sorry I'm so late. I was heading here, and I had to turn around and deal with a gangland killing in downtown Evansville." When we asked him for more details, it turns out that our friend Kenny Campbell was shot many dozens of times in the street of Evansville. And we decided that that was a story that we were not going to tell anybody ever. But the funny footnote to it was that if you remember the Campbell Soup song, and this man's name was Campbell, and the Campbell Soup song was good, good. That's what Campbell Soup is, good. Every time Birch or I would be together and we would go by a Denny's over the ensuing decades, one of us would hum the Campbell Soup song, and it would just crack us up. And it wasn't until his son Chris was getting married, I think in 2010, that I finally started telling this story, realizing that I was no longer under any legal jeopardy, and it was far enough in our past.
That's an extraordinary story. Actually, I do have two questions. We can get them in under the wire here. Olivia asks, in writing the book, did you come across any information about Senator Bayh that you didn't know previously?
Let me just add, before I answer that, there are a lot of stories that I had to take out of the book for space. And my website, which is blaimeier.us, has a lot of bonus features that I took out. This story I just told is one of them. So for anybody who's interested in those stories, as well as reading about the Bayh legacy and other stories about Birch that I had to pull out of the book, you can go to those bonus features. Were there anything I learned that I didn't know? Tons. I mean, we did 30 hours of interviews where I learned a lot. I also committed myself early on to fact check, because memories play tricks on you. I'll give you an example. He in our first interview on video, again 30 hours of video interviews with him over 12 sessions. I asked him, "Well, tell me about the stories of the presidents you met." He told me about his first meeting with Truman and Kennedy and so on. Then he gets to Gerald Ford. And he says, I'll never forget that. I met Jerry Ford, Don Rumsfeld, and Dick Cheney all in the bowels of the RFK Stadium getting ready for a congressional baseball game. And we were all in our jockstraps. I checked it, and that year, Dick Cheney was still in college. So there's no way he was in the bowels of the RFK Stadium at the time, although Birch kept saying, that has to be wrong. I'm sure he was there. And I said, no, Senator, he wasn't. I learned a lot. We talked a lot about his evolution on the issues of race. Things that that's something I knew nothing about when we started talking. I didn't know anything about his service in the Army when he served in the Army, or really his college stories. I made a point of studying up and refreshing a lot of memories about the Senate career. And there were things that that he didn't remember nearly as well, and I would almost have to prompt him by reading from our own press releases sometimes, or news clipping. So yeah, of course, there's a lot in the course of a lifetime. You learn an awful lot about somebody. There are tragic stories. There are funny stories. When tragic stories, he lost his mother when he was 12 years old. She had been in the hospital with cancer, and his father had been there most afternoons when Birch would get off school. Came back from school, called the hospital to ask his father if he could visit some friend or something after school. And the woman who answered the phone said, "Oh, Mr. Bayh isn't here. He left when his wife died." That was how Birch found out his mother died. And those kinds of stories, tear at your heartstrings. And then, of course, I was very much involved at the end of his wife Marvella's life. She died of cancer also in 1979, and was rushing Birch out to Charlottesville to tell Evan about the loss of his mother, when it turns out Evan found out because it was on television, and before we got there. So he found it out by someone he shouldn't have heard it from. There are stories like that that I found very engaging, very memorable. I had a lot of friends that gave me great advice in the writing of the book, to try to low key my own role, to not make it about me and about Birch and me, because it wasn't. It's not about me, it's about him. I like to think it's a tribute to him, and that he deserved it. He kept saying, as I said many times, I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to make a difference, and I think we did. And I thought he did. And that was why I thought his story was worthy of a biography.
Our final question tonight, Bob, is from John, and he asks, what's next for you after writing this wonderful book?
Wow. Well, hopefully the pandemic will end, and I'll do crazy things like go to a movie theater, eat in a restaurant, and watch baseball live and go to live theater. I'm going to become a grandfather in the fall for the first time, so that's very exciting. My youngest son, Dan's wife, Carly, is pregnant, and we're all quite excited about that. I want to start traveling again. I've actually had some book ideas that I've been working on, and right now I've been looking around to try to find an agent. I found the writing process a lot more enjoyable than I expected. I mean, when it started, it was very hard. And I've said to many friends of mine who want to write books that if you're going to write a book, write fiction. Being able to make it up is a lot easier than having it to be accurate, making it accurate. I think I can't imagine how hard it would be to write a biography without the internet. And I admire people that did it before, because the amount of time I would spend on the internet fact checking made it much more efficient. I thank goodness that he was able to read the first draft of the book. I would print out it every time I finished a chapter. I would print it out and mail it to him, and then he would call me. We'd have these long conversations, mostly laughing about it. And he would often say, "I can't believe we did all the different things we did." He started the Alcohol Fuels Commission, for instance, to study the creation of gasohol using grain, corn. This was another thing where he associated himself with as a problem solver. What else will I do? I like writing. I want to attend more baseball this year. My oldest son is in the musical theater world, and I want to attend more musical theater. I'm a big movie buff, and I want to go to movies. So there's a lot to look forward to. I've gotten my second vaccine, so I'm ready to get out of Dodge.
That's great, Bob. This has been a very educational and supremely entertaining program about one of the giants of the Senate. We really appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you, Bill. And you and the staff at the KU have been really helpful and professional and easy to work with, and I appreciate the honor that you've allowed me to do this.
Well, thank you very much for those comments. We do appreciate it. I wanted to tell our audience that our next evening program will be the third in our series of conversation on race. And Bob, you may want to tune in, being obviously a big baseball fan, because it's going to feature Bob Kendrick, who is the president of Kansas City's Negro League Baseball Museum. And he's going to talk about baseball, the color barrier. And it should be fascinating. That'll be April 14th at 7 p.m. We thank you very much for joining us, everyone, tonight. And we hope you enjoyed the program as much as I did. Have a great evening.
Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics for our program this evening. If you are a student and would like to join the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. In a few weeks, on Wednesday, April 14th, we look forward to hosting Bob Kendrick for his program, A Conversation on Race 3, Baseball, the Color Barrier. You can access this program on the Dole Institute's YouTube channel, just like tonight's program. Refer to doleinstitute.org for up-to-date information on all of our upcoming programs. We hope you enjoyed this evening's program. Thank you and have a good night.